Vanishing Folklore and Beliefs.
Modern Greek Folklore and Ancient Greek Religion by John Cuthbert Lawson, public domain reading. This text connects ancient Greek mythology with current Greek folklore. Today we're going to focus on Poseidon. This was written in 1910. Poseidon. For the survival of any god of the sea in the imagination of the Greek people, I cannot personally vouch. Though I have been among the seafaring population in many parts, I have never heard mention of other than female deities. That which I hear set down rests entirely on the authority of Bernhard Schmidt. In his collection of folk stories, there is one from Zakynthos entitled Captain 13, which runs as follows. A king who was the strongest man of his time made war on a neighbor. His strength lay in the 3 hairs on his breast. He was on the point of crushing his foes when his wife was bribed to cut off his hairs, and he, with 13 companions, was taken prisoner. But the hairs began to grow again, and so his enemies threw him and his companions into a pit. The others were killed by the fall, but he, being thrown in last, fell upon them and was unhurt. Over the pit his enemies then raised a mound. He found, however, in the pit a dead bird, and having fastened its wings to his hands, flew up and carried away, mound and all, with him. Then he soared high in the air until a storm of rain washed away the clay that held the feathers to his hands, and he fell into the sea. Then from out of the sea came the god thereof, Poseidon, and struck him with a 3-pronged trident. He was then changed into a dolphin until such time as he should find a maiden ready to be his wife. The dolphin after some time saved a shipwrecked king and his daughter, and the princess by way of reward took him for her husband, and the spell was broken. Other characteristics of this trident-bearing sea god are, according to the same authority, that he is in half form, half human and half fish, and that his wealth, consisting of all the treasures lost in the sea, is so great that he sleeps on a couch of gold, and that he rides upon dolphins. Thus Poseidon, it appears, or it may be Nereus, has survived locally in the remembrance of the Greek population as a deity unconnected with Christian values. Far more generally, however, his functions have been transferred to Saint Nicholas, whose aid is invariably invoked by seamen in time of peril, and who has acquired by the name sailor. The allusion to the sea god and his trident in the story which I have repeated must, I think, be accepted with some reserve, as being possibly a scholastic interpolation. I cannot find confirmation of it in or any other folk story. And moreover, the latter part of the tale is familiar to me in another form. The hero is usually a young prince who goes out to seek adventures in the world, not a king who has already a wife at home, and his transformation into a dolphin is effected by some malicious witch, into whose toils he falls. But while for these reasons I do not put the story forward as certain evidence of the survival of Poseidon in Greek popular memory, I have recounted it at some length because it is an excellent type of current folktale, and from a study of it we may now leave Poseidon and make a brief digression. We may appreciate the relation existing between such stories and the myths of antiquity. The king who was the strongest man of his time has a classical prototype in the Mysian leader Aristomenes. He too was thrown with his comrades into a pit by his enemies, the Spartans, and he alone escaped death from the fall, being borne up on the wings of eagles. Again, the idea of a man's strength residing in a certain hair or hairs is well known in ancient mythology, and although it is by no means peculiar to the Greeks, but it is common to many peoples of the world, we may fairly suppose that the modern Greek has not borrowed it from outside, but has inherited it from those ancestors among those myths who the story of Scylla and Nisus were based on. Lastly, in the incident of the hero fastening wings to his arms with clay and his subsequent fall into the sea, these are all the essentials of the legend of Icarus. Here then, combined in one modern folk story, we find the motifs of three separate ancient myths, and from it, and others of like nature, for in the collection from which I have borrowed it, there are several stories in which such figures as Midas, the Sphinx, and the Cyclops are easily recognized. An inference may be drawn as to the real relation of ancient mythology to modern folk stories. Certain themes must have existed from time immemorial, and these have been worked up into tales of successive generations of raconteurs with ever varying settings. Fresh combinations of motifs have been and are still being tried. Fresh embroidery of detail may be added by each artist. Only the theme in its plainest form, the mere groundwork of story, remains immutable. This at the same time explains the wide variations of the same myth, even among the ancients themselves, and warns us not to judge on the value of a modern folk story or folk song by the closeness of its resemblance to any ancient myth, which may have been preserved to us in literature. It was naturally the most finished and artistic presentment of the story which appeared to the taste of the educated men, and thus became the orthodox classical version. But there is every likelihood that before the story reached the stage of acknowledged perfection, much that was primitive had been suppressed as inartistic, and much that was not traditional had been added by the poet's imagination. The unlettered storyteller, endowed with less fancy and ignorant of the conventions of art, is actually a far trustier vehicle of pure tradition. For though he feels himself at liberty to compose variations of the original theme, he certainly has less power and generally less inclination to do so, for it is on exactness of memory and even verbal fidelity to the traditional form of the story that the modern storyteller chiefly prides himself. Hence the modern folk story, straight from the peasant's lips, in a form almost verbally identical with that in which successive generations of peasants before him narrated it, may contain more genuinely primitive material than a literary version of it, which dates from perhaps 2,000 years ago or more. If you enjoyed this reading, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This channel is updated daily. Thank you very much for listening.